You are already 32 and still single. Must be tough spending Christmas all alone. That was supposed to be my routine humiliation as the family disappointment. But this time, I did not show up to just take the hits. I came to memorize every fake smile and forged signature. Before New Year's Eve was over, this crystal-lit room would become ground zero, and they were going to watch their perfect little empire collapse right on top of them. I am Juliana Walker. The air in my parents' dining room always tasted like expensive regret and polished silver. It was Christmas evening in one of the wealthiest, most heavily gated suburbs just outside Chicago. A place where the snow seemed to fall exclusively to make the manicured. Sprawling lawns look appropriately festive for the holiday season. I was exactly 32 years old, and stepping through the towering mahogany double doors of Evelyn and Martin Walker's estate was always an exercise in grueling tactical endurance. The room was practically drowning in baccarat crystal, towering antique silver candelabras, and the suffocating, engineered scent of roasted pine and imported black truffles. I sat quietly at the absolute far end of the impossibly long dining table, nursing a simple crystal glass of sparkling water, fully aware of my assigned role in this annual theatrical production. I was the family's cautionary tale, the designated disappointment. The sharp, high-pitched clinking of a silver spoon against a delicate champagne flute abruptly cut through the low, sophisticated hum of classical music playing from the hidden sound system. My younger sister, Tessa Walker Klein, stood up from her chair at the center of the table. She was draped in a custom silk emerald gown that cost more than most working-class families made in an entire year. Her perfectly styled blonde hair catching every ounce of the chandelier's brilliant light. She smiled at the room, a dazzling, predatory thing specifically designed for society pages, donor galas, and carefully curated social media feeds. "A toast," Tessa announced, her voice echoing perfectly off the vaulted, hand-painted ceiling. She turned her gaze deliberately toward me, her eyes gleaming with a deeply manufactured, saccharine pity. "To my big sister, Juliana. You are already 32 and still single. Must be tough spending Christmas all alone." The long table immediately erupted into laughter. It was not polite, muffled, or sympathetic chuckling. It was the loud, validating, and cruel laughter of a family that thrived entirely on maintaining a strict social hierarchy. My mother, Evelyn, delicately dabbed at her professionally plumped lips with a monogrammed linen napkin, a distinct smirk playing at the carefully maintained corners of her mouth. My father, Martin, chuckled deeply from his chest, slowly swirling a glass of scotch that was older than I was. To Evelyn and Martin, Tessa was the ultimate, undisputed trophy. She was beautiful, totally socially compliant, and married to a rapidly rising star in the local elite circles. I, on the direct opposite hand, was the heavy, unspoken burden. I made excellent money, sure, but I flatly refused to play their country club games. I did not wear the right designer labels. I did not attend the right charity galas. I did not flatter the right power brokers. And therefore, I simply did not live up to the impossible Walker standard. They saw my independence not as a success, but as an insulting rejection of their entire value system. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not break eye contact with my sister. I slowly, deliberately placed my heavy silver dinner fork and knife down on the pristine bone china plate. The sharp metallic clink was precise enough to slice cleanly through the fading, mocking laughter of my relatives. I looked directly into Tessa's eyes. "I appreciate the deep concern, Tessa," I said, ensuring my voice remained completely flat, cold, and undeniably even, but I am not alone in the slightest. And I can assure you, my life is absolutely nothing like the miserable, lonely picture you have so vividly painted in your head. The laughter abruptly died in their throats. The silence that instantly followed was remarkably heavy, thick with a sudden, palpable discomfort. Evelyn visibly stiffened, her manicured hand freezing in midair near her red wine glass. Martin frowned, his bushy eyebrows knitting together in confusion and mild irritation. Tessa's flawless, camera-ready smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing slightly as she desperately tried to decode my absolute lack of emotional reaction. I had not given them the satisfaction of a flustered, tearful defense. I had given them a reinforced brick wall. Before the suffocating tension could mutate into a full-blown, table-wide argument, a loud throat cleared. Bryce Klein, Tessa's husband, leaned forward, clearly eager to rescue the spotlight and redirect it back to his favorite subject himself. Bryce was a newly minted, highly arrogant golden boy in the incredibly lucrative world of social real estate fundraising. He was a man who expertly sold the concept of community revitalization to guilty billionaires looking for easy public relations wins and massive tax write-offs. Well, speaking of not being alone and having big plans, Bryce smoothly pivoted, his blinding white teeth flashing in a heavily practiced, politician-style grin. We are going to have an absolutely full house very, very soon. The biggest night of our professional and personal lives. He reached down into his leather briefcase resting on the floor and pulled out a thick, customized, leather-bound presentation folder. He dropped it directly onto the polished mahogany table with a heavy, deeply satisfying thud that demanded everyone's attention. New Year's Eve, Bryce declared proudly, puffing out his broad chest as he looked around the table at the assembled aunts, uncles, and a couple of wealthy family friends my parents had invited explicitly just to show off to. We are officially hosting the inaugural charity gala at Ashbourne House. We are taking that massive, historic, completely boarded-up hotel downtown and turning it into the city's premier symbol of charitable housing. It is going to be the absolute crown jewel of the Second Harbor Renewal Fund. The entire table murmured in coordinated awe. Evelyn practically beamed with radiant maternal pride, leaning in close to admire the thick, expensive-looking folder. Martin nodded his head approvingly, raising his Scotch glass in a silent, respectful salute to his son-in-law. Bryce immediately began rattling off the exclusive guest list, his voice dripping with self-importance. He listed state senators, prominent hedge fund managers, and powerful tech executives. He painted a vivid, intoxicating picture of a glamorous night filled with crystal flutes, open checkbooks, and flashing cameras. A night that would permanently cement his name in the city's philanthropic history books. My eyes, however, drifted completely away from Bryce's self-satisfied face and landed squarely on the thick leather folder he had tossed onto the table. It was positioned just close enough to my side of the long table for me to easily read the deeply embossed gold lettering stamped onto the bottom right corner of the dark cover. It was not a decorative stamp. It was not a brand logo. It was a highly specific, standardized legal filing code. The code was simple, a distinct string of letters and sequential numbers. But to someone operating at my specific level in my particular profession, it was a blinding, flashing neon warning sign. It was a tracking sequence utilized exclusively by a highly specialized, ruthless financial oversight group. I recognized the formatting immediately. That specific alphanumeric sequence meant exactly one thing: Ashbourne House was absolutely not owned by Bryce Klein. It was not owned by his much-hyped charitable fund. The property was currently sitting inactive, deeply hostile, court-ordered receivership. Bryce was sitting right here at my parents' dining table, loudly boasting about a real estate empire he was supposedly building with his bare hands, completely and utterly oblivious to the fact that the very property he confidently claimed to control was actively being seized and monitored by a team of merciless forensic accountants. He possessed absolutely no legal authority over Ashbourne House. He did not own the bricks. He did not own the land. And he certainly did not have the legal right to host a massive fundraising gala inside its walls. I sat back slowly in my plush velvet dining chair, casually picking up my crystal water glass once again. I remained completely silent for the entire rest of the lavish meal. I did not offer a single word of congratulation while Bryce continued to bloviate endlessly about his grand, world-changing vision, his millions of dollars in projected corporate donations, and his supposedly impeccable political connections. Tessa sat right beside him, positively glowing with reflected glory, happily soaking in the jealous envy of our extended relatives. She looked at him like he was a conquering hero, completely unaware that her husband was a financial disaster waiting to happen. I took a very slow, measured sip of my sparkling water, feeling a distinctly cold, highly calculating sense of calm wash completely over my body. Bryce was not just a typical, everyday narcissist exaggerating his career success to impress his in-laws. He was a dangerous, desperate fool actively playing with matches in a room completely flooded with gasoline. He had absolutely no idea what kind of high stakes, fatal chessboard he had just confidently stepped onto, and he certainly had no idea that I already knew exactly how to play the game. Checkmate was only a matter of days away, and I was going to enjoy every single second of watching his empire burn. They thought my life was incredibly boring. My mother, Evelyn, frequently described my career to her wealthy tennis club friends as something related to administrative auditing. In her highly curated mind, I sat in a depressing, windowless gray cubicle under flickering fluorescent lights, stamping monotonous forms and alphabetizing endless stacks of manila files. The reality was significantly darker and infinitely more dangerous. I was a senior compliance investigator at Rook and Banner Forensic Advisory. We were the fiercely private, incredibly expensive firm that government agencies and massive institutional investors called in complete desperation when the numbers simply did not add up. When the glossy marketing brochures did not match the hidden offshore bank statements. We specialized exclusively in dissecting complex financial fraud, particularly within massive investment funds, high-profile charitable organizations, and multi-million-dollar urban redevelopment projects. My daily routine was absolutely not glamorous. There were no red carpets, no flattering lighting, and no flashing cameras to validate my existence. But my work possessed a razor-sharp, devastating edge. If a charismatic, beloved charity founder was secretly using cancer research donations to fund a private jet lease, I was the one who meticulously traced the wire transfers through 3 different shell companies in the Cayman Islands. If a prominent real estate developer was claiming millions of dollars in state tax credits for affordable housing that never actually got built, my signature was the one securely attached to the federal subpoena that ultimately froze their personal assets. I gave the worst kind of thieves, the ones who shamelessly hid their greed behind the shield of philanthropy, many sleepless nights. Tessa, naturally, operated on the exact opposite end of the human spectrum. My younger sister lived her entire, exhausting existence through the highly filtered, carefully directed lens of public perception. Her world was entirely constructed of custom couture evening gowns, exclusive donor dinners, and perfectly crafted, deeply emotional social media posts about giving back to the struggling community. Bryce had meticulously built his personal brand as the rugged, visionary man saving the city's forgotten neighborhoods from inevitable urban decay. Together, they were the undisputed golden couple of the charity circuit, expertly selling a flawless image of boundless generosity while never actually getting their manicured hands dirty. Evelyn and Martin absolutely worshipped that specific brand of performative success. It intensely validated their own incredibly shallow existence. Having Tessa and Bryce in the family meant they were permanently guaranteed premium invitations to the most exclusive, high society galas in the state. It meant constantly rubbing shoulders with the local political elite and the ultra-wealthy legacy families they so desperately wanted to emulate. They felt they truly belonged in those vast rooms filled with clinking champagne glasses, silent auctions, and superficial conversations. They did not want to hear a single word about the grueling, paper-filled reality of the financial world that I actually inhabited. To them, my stubborn insistence on objective facts, rigid regulations, and strict legal compliance was just undeniable proof that I lacked vision and basic social grace. I was too rigid. I was too cynical. I was, in their deeply judgmental eyes, simply not built for their refined, superior world. But my career choice was only a secondary offense. I carried a much deeper, far more unforgivable sin in my parents' eyes. The true, festering source of their enduring resentment was made of crumbling red brick and weathered oak wood. sitting quietly in the city's historic, cobblestone-lined old district. When my maternal grandmother passed away 5 years ago, she did not divide her substantial assets equally among the family. She left her massive, highly profitable investment portfolio directly to Evelyn, but she left her home an antique, 4-story brownstone exclusively to me. It was not just any random piece of real estate. The entire ground floor had been a beloved, fiercely independent little bookstore for nearly 4 decades. To the rest of my family, it was nothing more than a dilapidated, embarrassing building sitting in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, something to be immediately bulldozed or liquidated for a massive, instantaneous cash payout. But to me, that old brownstone was the absolute only place on earth I had ever felt entirely safe. While my parents were always too busy aggressively molding Tessa into a perfect society debutante, I had spent my childhood summers hiding in the dusty, quiet aisles of my grandmother's shop, breathing in the comforting scent of aging paper, dark roast coffee, and lemon floor wax. She understood my quiet nature in a way Evelyn never even bothered to try, because the legal title to the brownstone went directly to me and completely bypassed Tessa. Evelyn had never truly forgiven me. She viewed my grandmother's last will and testament not as a standard legal document, but as a deliberate, calculated, and deeply personal insult. My mother believed with every fiber of her being that Tessa, the beautiful, popular daughter who would undoubtedly host elegant, catered parties, deserved the historic property to boost her own social standing. My flat refusal to sell the building to developers, my absolute insistence on keeping the little bookstore running with a dedicated local manager, was a constant, daily reminder to Evelyn that she did not have absolute, dictatorial control over everything in our family. What Evelyn, Martin, and Tessa absolutely did not know, however, was that the sturdy old brownstone was not my only hidden sanctuary. I had another secret, one I guarded with a ruthless ferocity that bordered on clinical paranoia. For over 2 years, I had been a legally married woman. His name was Callum Price. He was a man who operated entirely in the dense shadows of the international financial world. A fiercely private, incredibly intelligent individual who abhorred the public spotlight exactly as much as Bryce craved it. Callum was brilliant, observant, and possessed a deeply grounding, unbreakable presence that completely anchored my often chaotic, high-stakes life. We had met during a particularly grueling, heavily contested investigation involving a hostile corporate takeover. We did not have a lavish, theatrical wedding. There were no melting ice sculptures, no 10-tier fondant cakes, and certainly no Walker family members in attendance to ruin the day. We walked into the downtown city courthouse on a rainy Tuesday morning, signed the legal papers, and quietly promised to protect each other from the exhausting noise of the outside world. I kept Callum completely hidden from my family because I simply did not trust them with anything pure. I knew exactly what they would do the second they found out. Evelyn would instantly judge his family background. Martin would aggressively and inappropriately probe into his financial portfolio, and Tessa would immediately try to find a way to use his elite connections to elevate her own social standing. They systematically ruined everything they touched with their insatiable hunger for status. I loved Callum entirely too much to let them drag their dirty, manicured claws through the absolute best part of my life. In the Walker family dynamic, personal information was strictly treated as heavy ammunition, and I absolutely refused to hand them a fully loaded gun. The lavish Christmas dinner was finally, mercifully winding down. The hired caterers were silently clearing away the delicate dessert plates, removing the remnants of a wildly expensive imported chocolate tart that almost no one had actually eaten. My father retreated to his mahogany-paneled study with a fresh, heavy pour of scotch, and Evelyn was busy aggressively instructing the kitchen staff on how to properly store the leftover white truffles. I stood up from the long table, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my dark wool trousers, fully intending to slip out the side door, retrieve my heavy winter coat, and drive straight back to the quiet, peaceful warmth of my real home with Callum. I had fulfilled my mandatory familial obligation for the holiday. I had silently endured the annual mockery. "Juliana," Tessa called out loudly from the other end of the dining room. Her voice was suddenly completely devoid of its usual, breathy theatricality. It was sharp, tight, and completely focused. "Do not leave just yet. Bryce and I need you to stay for a few more minutes." I stopped right in the center of the grand archway leading to the marble foyer and slowly turned around. Tessa was standing very close to her husband, her arms crossed tightly over her chest in a highly defensive posture. Bryce had picked up the thick leather folder again, the exact same one with the glaringly obvious receivership code stamped on the front cover. He was tapping his index finger rhythmically and nervously against the expensive binding. "We have some very important family business to discuss," Tessa added, her trademark dazzling smile returning to her face, though the practiced warmth absolutely did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the dining room shifted instantly. The sudden, ugly realization hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow to the stomach. The cruel, mocking toast at the beginning of dinner, the deliberate, public attack on my single status, and the grand, boastful presentation of the Ashbourne House project, it had all been a meticulously choreographed performance. It was classic. Textbook Walker family strategy. You break the target down emotionally, isolate them from the herd, make them feel incredibly small and defensive, and then, right when they are supposedly desperate to earn back just a tiny shred of familial approval, you finally make your real move. The public humiliation was just the mandatory softening tactic. The actual main event was whatever unsigned legal document Bryce was currently holding in his sweating hands. They desperately needed something from me. And judging by the hungry predatory look shining in my younger sister's eyes, it was something they were fully willing to tear me apart to get. The heavy oak doors of my father's private study closed with a distinct, suffocating click. The air inside the room was thick with the heavy aroma of aged leather bindings, expensive cigar smoke, and an undeniable, predatory anticipation. Martin immediately took his usual position behind the massive mahogany desk, settling into his high-backed leather executive chair like a Supreme Court justice preparing to deliver a guilty verdict. Evelyn positioned herself strategically by the unlit marble fireplace, her posture rigidly perfect and her expression totally unreadable. Tessa draped her emerald-gowned frame casually across the Chesterfield sofa, swirling a fresh glass of expensive champagne, while Bryce stood directly in the center of the intricately woven Persian rug, holding that exact same leather-bound folder he had flaunted at the dinner table. They had expertly cornered me in the one specific room of the estate designed entirely for intimidation. "Have a seat, Juliana," Bryce offered, flashing a highly manufactured, overly familiar grin. He gestured grandly toward one of the stiff, deeply uncomfortable guest chairs positioned opposite the mahogany desk. I remained firmly standing, crossing my arms loosely over my chest. "I prefer to stand." What exactly is this about?" "Bryce," he chuckled, a hollow, perfectly practiced sound, and moved toward the desk, flipping the heavy leather folder open. He slid a thick stack of stapled, high-bond paper toward the edge of the wood, directly into my immediate line of sight. "It is incredibly straightforward," Bryce began, his tone dripping with false modesty and artificial warmth. "As I briefly mentioned at dinner, the Second Harbor Renewal Fund is expanding at a staggering rate. We are bringing in massive amounts of institutional capital to rebuild this city. Because of the sheer volume of the incoming charitable investments, our board of directors requires a slightly more robust administrative structure. We are officially creating an honorary advisory board, a specialized compliance oversight committee, if you want to use the technical jargon." He tapped the pristine white cover page with his index finger, smiling broadly. "Given your highly specific professional background in the financial sector, having your name listed as an honorary advisor would be a tremendous asset for us. It is purely optical. Of course, a strictly ceremonial title. You will not have to attend a single board meeting, review any daily ledgers, or do a single hour of actual physical work. It just makes the entire charity portfolio look incredibly secure to the state regulators when they inevitably see a senior investigator from a top-tier firm featured prominently on the masthead. I looked down at the document resting on the polished wood. It appeared to be a standard declaration of fiduciary compliance. But it only took me exactly 4 seconds to spot the glaring, terrifyingly amateurish traps woven directly into the text. My eyes scanned the first page, and the seasoned forensic investigator living inside my brain immediately began sounding every available alarm. There were 3 massive, undeniable anomalies visible right on the surface. First, the official state notary seal stamped near the bottom left margin was completely off-axis. It lacked the microscopic, physical indentation of a genuine steel stamp. The edges were slightly blurred and pixelated. A classic, textbook hallmark of a low-resolution digital image lifted illegally from another document and pasted onto this one. Second, the primary signature block located at the bottom of page 2 featured a faint, grayish rectangular halo surrounding the cursive blue ink. Someone had definitively scanned an old signature, cropped it poorly, and layered it directly over the new text to bypass a physical signing. But the third anomaly was the absolute worst, the one that proved intentional. Malicious fraud. Down in Section 4, Paragraph 7. The standard legal indemnification clause had been brutally butchered. The font kerning was abruptly compressed, completely out of sync with the precise spacing of the rest of the document. A single, clumsily phrased sentence had been wedged into the paragraph, effectively stating that I, as the compliance advisor, would assume full personal liability for verifying the legal origin and clean status of all incoming fund assets. Bryce was absolutely not offering me a prestigious honorary title. He was actively trying to frame me as the ultimate, legally binding scapegoat for whatever massive financial crimes he was currently running through his labyrinth of shell companies. "It is just a standard boilerplate agreement," Bryce pressed, completely misinterpreting my total silence for nervous hesitation rather than absolute, cold-blooded horror. "You deal with these incredibly boring papers all day long at your office. Just put your signature on the last page. Consider it a small favor. It is a very simple way for you to finally contribute something meaningful to the family's overall public success." Tessa let out a sharp, highly derisive laugh from the leather sofa. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, her eyes glittering with unfiltered, joyful malice. "Honestly, Juliana, do not be so incredibly dramatic about a few pieces of paper. You literally have zero social life. You have no husband to go home to. You have 0 children to care for. And you spend every single weekend locked inside your depressing apartment. The absolute least you can do is use that incredibly boring, mind-numbing desk job of yours to actually help the people who share your blood and carry your last name." "She is entirely right," Evelyn chimed in instantly, seamlessly picking up the thread of the coordinated psychological attack. She stepped away from the cold fireplace, her voice adopting that sickly sweet, deeply condescending tone she reserved exclusively for lecturing me. "If Bryce successfully secures this next tier of elite funding, our entire family rises in social standing. We all benefit immensely from the prestige of the Ashbourne House project. Do not be so stubbornly self-righteous. Juliana, we all know you are just being difficult because you are intensely jealous of the beautiful, deeply successful life your sister has built for herself." The sheer, blinding audacity of the accusation hung heavily in the stale air of the study. My mother genuinely believed my quiet reluctance was born of petty sibling rivalry, completely blind to the fact that I was currently staring at a highly illegal, clumsily forged financial document that could easily result in a 10-year federal prison sentence for anyone foolish enough to sign it. Then, Martin decided to deliver the final, authoritative blow. He slammed his heavy, flat palm down onto the surface of his mahogany desk, the loud smack echoing sharply off the expensive wood-paneled walls. "Enough of this silent, petulant behavior," Martin demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding register that brooked no argument. "Bryce is out there in the real world, doing the actual heavy lifting. He is building real homes for the community. He is making a tangible, historical difference in this city. All you do is sit in a gray cubicle and look for tiny, insignificant spelling mistakes to ruin other people's hard work. If you refuse to sign a simple piece of paper to help your own brother-in-law achieve something great, then you are proving exactly how thoroughly selfish and bitter you have truly become. The combined, crushing pressure in the room was clearly designed to be entirely suffocating. It was a perfectly executed emotional ambush, leveraging deep familial guilt, manufactured shame, and rigid parental authority to force my immediate compliance. A much weaker version of myself, the terrified teenager who used to hide in the quiet aisles of the old bookstore, might have blindly reached for the heavy gold-plated pens sitting on the desk just to make the relentless verbal abuse stop. Instead, I kept my hands firmly planted at my sides. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not offer a tearful, desperate defense of my character, my morals, or my chosen career. I simply looked directly at Bryce, locking my eyes onto his increasingly anxious face, and let the silence stretch until it became physically painful for him. If this document is as pristine and legally standard as you claim it is, Bryce, I said, my voice completely flat, cutting through the heavy tension in the room like a surgical scalpel through incredibly thin paper. Then why, exactly, are you so absolutely terrified to let an independent, third-party attorney review it before I put my ink on that dotted line? The effect was instantaneous and incredibly violent. The entire room completely froze. Martin's jaw snapped shut with an audible click. Evelyn stopped breathing right in the middle of a self-righteous sigh. Tessa's arrogant, mocking smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a sudden, sharp look of genuine confusion. But Bryce's reaction was the absolute most telling. All the artificial, healthy color instantly drained from his perfectly tanned face. The charming, practiced politician-style smile shattered into a million jagged pieces. Panic, raw, ugly, and unadulterated, flared brightly in his eyes for a fraction of a second before he violently suppressed it. He lunged forward across the desk, his hand darting out to snatch the heavy stack of paper off the wood before I could even attempt to reach out and touch it. He shoved the forged document back into the leather folder with frantic, completely uncoordinated movements, snapping the magnetic closure shut with a loud, aggressive snap. "Fine," Bryce spat out, his voice suddenly tight, breathless, and entirely devoid of its previous smooth, manipulative confidence. He forced his mouth into a rigid, deeply unnatural facsimile of a smile that looked more like a grimace. "You do not have to sign it tonight. We can completely table the administrative paperwork for now. Take all the time you need to feel fully comfortable." He took a quick step closer to me, aggressively invading my personal space, his expensive cologne suddenly smelling sharp and sour with nervous sweat. "But you will absolutely be there," Bryce dictated, his tone shifting completely from manipulative warmth to an absolute, undeniable threat. "On the 31st of December, you will show up at the Ashbourne House Gala. You will wear a proper evening dress. You will stand right next to me on that main stage. And you will publicly, verbally endorse this charity in front of every single major donor and reporter in that room. If you refuse to do that, Juliana, I promise you, you will deeply regret the consequences." He did not wait for my response. Bryce practically shoved his way past me, throwing the heavy oak doors open and storming out into the grand, brightly lit hallway. The silence he left behind in the study was absolutely deafening, heavy with the undeniable, electric realization that the casual family dinner had officially mutated into an active, high-stakes war. High stakes. The frigid December air hit my face the absolute second I stepped out of the heavy front doors. The crisp, rhythmic crunch of my leather heels against the imported gravel of the circular driveway was the only sound breaking the dead, suffocating silence of the sprawling suburban estate. I was exactly halfway to my understated sedan when the heavy mahogany door slammed open violently behind me. Rapid, highly aggressive footsteps crunched over the frozen gravel. I did not need to turn around to know exactly who was stalking me. The cloying, Overwhelming scent of Tessa's signature gardenia perfume hit the freezing night air, a split second before her voice did. "Do you honestly think you can just walk away like that?" Tessa hissed, stepping directly into my immediate path and blocking the driver's side door. The bright, motion-activated security floodlights illuminated them perfectly against the dark winter backdrop. Gone was the radiant, socially flawless couple from the dining room. They looked exactly like cornered predators. Bryce stood just behind her right shoulder. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscle ticked visibly under his tanned skin. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his expensive wool overcoat, his posture rigid with barely suppressed rage. I reached out for my car door handle, as my bare left hand slipped out from the protective cuff of my heavy cashmere coat. The harsh white security light caught a sudden, brilliant flash of metal. I usually wore leather gloves to these mandatory family functions, specifically to keep my personal life entirely invisible. But I had left them buried deep in my coat pocket in my haste to exit the suffocating atmosphere of my father's study. Tessa's sharp, predatory eyes darted down instantly. Her gaze locked permanently onto the completely unadorned, flawlessly smooth band of solid platinum resting quietly on my left ring finger. A slow, genuinely malicious smile spread across my younger sister's face. She let out a soft, highly theatrical gasp of mock surprise. "Well, look at this," Tessa purred, stepping even closer, her eyes gleaming with the absolute thrill of discovering what she firmly believed to be dirty ammunition. "Look at the strictly moral, incredibly boring compliance officer, a solid platinum band on the left hand. You are hiding a man. And given how completely pathetic and empty your social life is, I can only assume you are the dirty little secret of someone with very deep pockets. An older, senior partner at your firm. Perhaps a married, wealthy client who bought you a quiet piece of jewelry to keep you docile in that miserable little apartment." I did not pull my hand back. I did not attempt to hide the ring. I simply let her look at it, my facial expression entirely blank and devoid of any defensive emotion. Bryce let out a harsh, degrading scoff, stepping up right beside his wife to present a united, imposing front of physical intimidation. "You think you are so incredibly untouchable, Juliana," Bryce sneered, his voice dropping an octave into a forced, theatrical menace designed to frighten someone much weaker. "You think you can sit in my father-in-law's private study and demand independent legal reviews like you hold any actual power in the real world. Let me make something absolutely clear to you right now. I operate in the absolute highest echelons of this city's real estate and elite donor networks. I know the powerful people who move billions of dollars. I have more than enough high-level connections to completely rip open every single aspect of your heavily guarded, secretive life. I can dig up your private bank accounts, your hidden assets, and whatever pathetic, rich married man is currently funding your sudden, unearned surge of arrogance." I slowly turned my head to look him dead in the eye. The sheer, blinding arrogance of his threat was almost amusing. But I absolutely refused to smile. My practiced calmness was a highly effective weapon, and I wielded it with surgical precision. "My private life," I replied, my voice as cold and hard as the thick frost gathering on the windshield of my car, "does not require the approval, nor the amateur investigation, of a desperate man who builds his entire professional reputation on clumsily forged legal dossiers." The words landed like a brutal, physical blow to his chest. Bryce flinched backward, the manufactured confidence shattering completely for a brief, highly revealing moment. He quickly recovered, his face flushing a deep, angry red under the stark white lights. He abandoned the arrogant mockery entirely and shifted instantly into raw, desperate extortion. "If you do anything to sabotage the New Year's Eve gala," Bryce threatened, stepping so close I could feel the nervous heat radiating off his body, "I will personally make sure the local press receives a highly detailed, anonymous tip. I will tell them that you deliberately forged your own corporate title to illegally interfere with a massive charitable housing fund out of pure, bitter spite. I know the managing partners at Rook & Banner. I will have you fired, publicly disgraced, and permanently blacklisted from the entire financial sector before the first week of January is even over. I held his furious, panicked gaze for 5 long, agonizing seconds. I let him feel the absolute weight of his own empty threats. Then, I simply opened my heavy car door, slid gracefully into the driver's seat, and started the quiet engine. I rolled the tinted window down exactly 2 inches. "I will see you both on the 31st, I said quietly into the freezing air, before rolling the glass back up tightly and driving smoothly away down the long driveway, leaving them standing entirely alone in the biting cold. The solitary drive back to the bustling city center took exactly 45 minutes. By the time I finally unlocked the heavy, reinforced wooden door of my old brownstone, the toxic, suffocating residue of my family's estate began to finally wash away. The deeply familiar, comforting scent of aging paper and roasted espresso beans wafted up from the darkened bookstore on the ground floor, grounding me instantly in my own reality. I walked slowly up the creaking oak stairs to our private living quarters, tossing my car keys onto the marble entryway table. I had barely slipped out of my restrictive wool trousers and into a soft, oversized cashmere sweater when my heavily encrypted secure phone began vibrating intensely against the kitchen counter. The dark screen displayed a single, scrambled initial. It was Callum. I answered the encrypted call instantly, pressing the cold glass of the phone to my ear. "Are you still at the London office?" "I am." Callum's voice flowed clearly through the speaker. Low, deeply resonant, and entirely devoid of panic. It was the precise voice of a man who routinely handled international corporate warfare before his morning coffee. "But we have a slight, highly interesting situation developing locally on your end. Are you currently alone?" "Yes. I just walked through my front door 2 minutes ago." "What happened?" "Approximately 20 minutes ago," Callum stated, his tone shifting effortlessly into pure, analytical precision. "Someone utilized a stolen, low-level guest credential to attempt an unauthorized remote entry into the strictly sealed, court-monitored server housing the Ashbourne House receivership files." I stopped moving completely. I stood perfectly still in the dead center of the dark kitchen. 20 minutes ago. That was the exact time I had driven away from the sprawling estate, leaving a desperate, furious Bryce Klein fuming in the gravel driveway. "Did they successfully breach the primary firewall?" I asked, my mind instantly calculating the severe legal ramifications of a cyber intrusion on a court-ordered hold. "They breached the outer perimeter briefly before the automated defense protocols flagged the specific anomaly," Callum explained smoothly, the sound of a keyboard clacking softly in the background. "The intruder did not attempt to steal raw financial data or alter the physical property deed. Their objective was highly specific and entirely personal. They attempted to forcibly insert your full legal name and your exact corporate title at Rook and Banner into a drafted, backdated board resolution document hidden deep inside the charity's digital administrative archives." The absolute silence of the old brownstone suddenly felt incredibly heavy. Callum did not ask me for unnecessary context. He did not demand to know what had transpired at the disastrous Christmas dinner. He simply understood the exact, malicious geometry of the trap currently being laid. "He is not just showing off his supposedly elite technical connections," Callum said, delivering the singular, devastating conclusion with chilling calm. "He knows the federal auditors are actively circling the fund. He is actively building an elaborate escape hatch. He is meticulously laying down a forged digital paper trail to drag you down as the primary architect of the entire fraud when the structural integrity inevitably collapses." A cold, sharp shiver ran rapidly down my spine, entirely unrelated to the freezing winter weather howling outside my windows. Bryce was significantly more dangerous than a simple, arrogant con artist. He was a completely cornered animal, entirely willing to completely destroy his own family member by framing them for a federal felony just to save his own skin. "Did your private security team block his unauthorized access entirely?" I asked, walking slowly over to the large bay window overlooking the quiet, snow-covered city street. "The automated system paused his document upload attempt pending manual administrator approval. I can have my security director permanently sever the connection, lock him out, and wipe his specific IP address from the server logs with a single keystroke. Callum offered, his voice acting as a steady, unbreakable anchor in the sudden storm. I looked out at the yellow streetlights reflecting brightly off the fresh white snow. If we blocked his clumsy attempt right now, Bryce would instantly panic. He would scramble to find another way, perhaps a significantly messier, far more unpredictable route, to secure his legal survival. I needed him to feel absolutely confident. I needed him to believe his crude little cyber trap had worked flawlessly. No, I instructed, my voice dropping into a low register of absolute, unforgiving resolve. Do not block him. Manually approve the upload. There was a brief, highly charged pause on the secure line. Callum, brilliant and ruthless as always, instantly caught the dangerous, calculating rhythm of my strategy. You want him to finish building his own gallows, Callum noted quietly, a hint of dark approval lacing his tone. Exactly, I replied firmly. Let him insert my name into the documents. Let him forge the digital signatures. Let him take 3 or 4 more steps completely unimpeded by our firewalls. I want him to walk so incredibly far out onto that thin ice that when it finally shatters underneath his feet on New Year's Eve, he will not be able to stand back up and hide behind some cheap, rehearsed excuse about a simple administrative error. Let him commit the undeniable felony directly on his own personal computer. Understood completely. Callum agreed without a second of hesitation. I will have the security team quietly log every single keystroke he makes and mirror the corrupted data to a highly secure offline drive for your exclusive personal use. I am flying back to the city on the 29th. I will see you then, I said softly, the heavy tension finally leaving my tired shoulders. I hung up the phone and placed it carefully onto the cold marble counter. The trap was officially set, but I was no longer the designated prey. The persistent, angry buzzing of my secure phone vibrating against the mahogany nightstand dragged me out of a surprisingly deep sleep just before 7 o'clock in the morning on the 26th of December. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold screen, and pulled the device toward my face. The notification counter for the extended Walker family group chat was climbing rapidly, ticking past 40 unread messages in a matter of seconds. I tapped the screen and opened the thread. Tessa had been incredibly busy since I left their driveway. She had meticulously crafted a sprawling, deeply fictionalized narrative and deployed it to aunts, uncles, and cousins scattered across the country. According to my younger sister, I had shown up to Christmas dinner heavily intoxicated and consumed by an ugly, bitter jealousy over her perfect marriage. The story claimed I had thrown a vicious, drunken tantrum in our father's study, screaming wildly and desperately trying to sabotage Bryce's noble community housing fund out of pure, unadulterated spite. It was a masterclass in preemptive character assassination. But Tessa had not stopped at family gossip. Mixed in with the shocked, condemning replies from various relatives were screenshots Tessa had strategically forwarded. They were anxious messages from a handful of minor, easily swayed local donors people who moved in Evelyn's suburban tennis circles. They were actively messaging Bryce, demanding to know why the compliance expert within his own family stubbornly refused to publicly verify that his charitable fund was entirely clean. Tessa was deliberately poisoning the well, creating a massive, highly visible crisis of confidence that laid the blame squarely on my shoulders. Before I could even process the sheer volume of the fabricated drama, the group chat notifications vanished, replaced by an incoming call. The caller ID displayed Evelyn Walker. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, measured breath to completely center myself, before sliding my thumb across the screen to answer. "Good morning, Juliana," my mother sang through the speaker. Her voice was dripping with that specific, manufactured sweetness she always used right before driving a knife into someone's back. "I hope you slept well after your little emotional outburst last night." "I slept perfectly fine, Mother," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral, refusing to take the bait. "What exactly do you want at this hour?" The artificial warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating edge that stripped away any remaining illusion of maternal affection. I am calling to give you one final opportunity to rectify your disastrous behavior, Evelyn stated sharply. You have caused a massive problem for your brother-in-law. People are starting to ask very uncomfortable questions because of your selfish refusal to cooperate. So, we have made a family decision. You are going to attend the gala on the 31st of December. You will put on a proper dress. You will stand on that stage. And you will give Bryce your complete, unreserved professional endorsement. If you refuse to do this, Juliana, we are going to court. I sat up slowly, the heavy down comforter falling away from my shoulders. Court for what? Exactly, we are officially filing a lawsuit to completely overturn your grandmother's will, Evelyn declared, her voice echoing with absolute, self-righteous certainty. We have already spoken with the family attorneys. They agree that Mother was incredibly frail and mentally compromised during the final months of her life. They are prepared to argue that you exerted undue influence over a vulnerable woman to steal the historic property that rightfully belongs to the entire family. We already have a legal proposal drafted to immediately transfer the brownstone into a newly formed family land trust, where it can be properly and fairly managed by your father and Bryce. The icy reality of her words washed over me, crystallizing the chaotic events of the previous evening into perfect, terrifying clarity. This was absolutely not a spontaneous reaction to a ruined dinner. This was a highly orchestrated, premeditated siege. They had the legal paperwork drafted. They had the narrative planted. They were explicitly targeting the only physical space in the world that I genuinely loved, holding my sanctuary hostage to force my compliance in Bryce's massive financial fraud. You would drag your own mother's name through a brutal, public court battle just to secure a photo opportunity for Bryce, I asked, though I already knew the devastating answer. I am doing what is absolutely necessary to protect the legacy of this family. Evelyn snapped back, her patience entirely exhausted. You have exactly 5 days to decide what is more important to you, your ridiculous, stubborn pride, or that crumbling old bookstore. Make the right choice. Juliana. She terminated the call with a sharp click. I sat in the silent bedroom, the cold screen of the phone pressing into my palm. They wanted the brownstone. But why the brownstone specifically? Evelyn had always hated that I owned it. But mobilizing a massive legal strike just to feed Tessa's ego felt entirely disproportionate. Even for my family. There had to be a deeper structural reason. I immediately dialed Callum's private international line. He answered on the very first ring. They just threatened to sue me for undue influence to overturn the will, I informed him, skipping the standard greetings entirely. They want to force the brownstone into a family land trust controlled by Bryce. Evelyn just issued the ultimatum. I sign my name to the charity at the gala, or they take the house. I heard the distinct sound of a pen dropping onto a hard desk surface thousands of miles away. Callum exhaled slowly. I was just looking at the architectural surveys the security team pulled from his failed unauthorized server breach last night, Callum said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, analytical fury. I was wondering why a fraudster focused entirely on downtown high-rises was so incredibly desperate to secure a tiny piece of historic residential property. Now it makes perfect, terrifying sense. This is not just about your mother's petty resentment. Juliana. This is the absolute cornerstone of his entire financial survival. Explain it to me, I demanded, walking out of the bedroom and heading straight toward the kitchen to start the espresso machine. Bryce is currently trying to secure a massive, historic rehabilitation credit structure to fund the Ashbourne House project, Callum explained, his words precise and methodical. We are talking about a syndicated loan worth tens of millions of dollars. It is the only way he can actually pay back the initial investors he has already defrauded and keep his Ponzi scheme afloat for another 12 to 18 months. But there is a massive, fatal flaw in his application. The Ashbourne property is completely landlocked on 3 sides by municipal utility lines. It fails the city's strict emergency access code for a commercial gathering space of that specific size. I stopped moving, my hand hovering right above the coffee grinder. The puzzle pieces were suddenly slamming together with devastating force. "The southern property line of the Ashbourne lot," I murmured, my mind rapidly pulling up the city zoning maps I had studied years ago. "Exactly," Callum confirmed immediately. "The southern property line of the Ashbourne Hotel backs up directly against the narrow service alley behind your brownstone. If Bryce can legally force your property into a family trust that he controls, he instantly grants himself permanent easement rights. He can pave right over your grandmother's old garden, create the mandatory secondary fire access route, and instantly unlock tens of millions of dollars in federal and state funding. Your little bookstore is the absolute only physical key that can open his massive vault of stolen money." The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. They were not simply trying to embarrass me. They were actively conspiring to legally steal my inheritance, pave over my childhood memories, and use my property to legitimize a massive criminal enterprise, all while smiling brightly for the society photographers. Bryce had likely convinced my parents that it was merely a smart, aggressive business maneuver, keeping them entirely ignorant of the massive federal prison sentence waiting at the end of the road. Or worse, they simply did not care how he got the money. As long as the Walker family name remained printed on the glossy gala invitations. A deep, unfamiliar heat began to spread rapidly through my chest. It was not the familiar, heavy weight of childhood sadness or the frustrating sting of parental rejection. It was the pure, white-hot, diamond-hard clarity of absolute war. They had chosen the battlefield, they had chosen the weapons, and they had just handed me the exact blueprints to their entire fragile fortress. "Callum," I said, my voice eerily calm against the rushing noise of the city waking up outside my window. "Do whatever you have to do to expedite your flight. I want you back in the city by the 28th at the absolute latest." "Consider it done," he replied, recognizing the lethal shift in my tone. "What is your next move?" "I'm going to give my mother exactly what she wants," I answered quietly. I ended the secure call and immediately opened the message thread with Evelyn. I did not bother typing out a long, emotional response. I did not demand apologies or threaten counter lawsuits. I simply typed out a single, definitive sentence, ensuring my compliance was officially on the record for their little trap. "I will be at the gala on the 31st of December, I typed, staring at the glowing words on the screen. Then, I added the final, crucial detail, a silent promise of the absolute destruction I was about to bring down upon their heads. But I want to make it perfectly clear right now. I will not be attending alone." I hit send, placed the phone face down on the marble counter, and finally turned on the espresso machine. The trap was set, the players were positioned, and the countdown to midnight had officially begun. Callum walked through the heavy wooden door of the brownstone on the 28th of December, bringing the freezing winter air and 3 heavily encrypted laptops with him. We cleared the antique oak dining table on the second floor, pushing aside my grandmother's vintage tea sets to make room for a labyrinth of tangled charging cables and glowing screens. For the next 72 hours, the quiet apartment above the sleepy bookstore transformed into a highly classified forensic command center. The first thread we pulled completely unraveled Bryce's entire foundational lie. By cross-referencing the internal access logs of Ashbourne House with the sealed court dockets Callum had cleanly extracted, the reality of the real estate acquisition became startlingly clear. Bryce Klein had never purchased Ashbourne House. He had not secured a single mortgage, nor had he transferred a single dollar in earnest money. Instead, he had exploited a highly technical, temporary vulnerability in the municipal foreclosure process. He had successfully forged a series of administrative letters, officially impersonating the designated intake agent for the property management firm overseeing the hostile receivership. He had essentially walked into a vacant, legally frozen building, changed the heavy brass locks, and loudly declared himself the visionary owner. It was a staggering act of breathtaking audacity, built entirely on the assumption that no one in his elite social circle would ever stoop to verifying a basic public record. But the illegal occupation of the historic hotel was merely the stage. The second harbor renewal fund was the actual bleeding wound. I spent 20 straight hours meticulously tracking the outbound wire transfers from the primary charity accounts. The marketing brochures Tessa constantly posted online promised that every single dollar went directly towards subsidized community housing materials and displaced family relocation programs. The raw, unfiltered bank ledgers told a completely different, deeply sinister story. The moment the wealthy donors wired their large contributions into the main account, the capital was aggressively fragmented and immediately routed into a complex network of anonymous shell companies. I highlighted line after line of fraudulent disbursements. There were invoices for hundreds of thousands of dollars, categorized broadly as landscape design, paid directly to a newly formed limited liability company registered to a virtual mailbox in another state. There were massive, recurring monthly retainer fees for community consulting and preliminary material surveying, all flowing directly into offshore accounts that Callum quickly linked right back to Bryce's personal holding company. The charity was not building homes. It was a highly efficient, rapidly spinning vacuum, sucking up philanthropic goodwill and converting it instantly into untraceable private wealth. The most devastating discoveries, however, were entirely domestic. As the digital net tightened, the pristine, untouchable image of the Walker family completely shattered under the weight of their own greed. Tessa, acting in her official capacity as the highly publicized brand ambassador of the fund, had personally authorized dozens of these massive, fraudulent wire transfers. She had attached her flawless, sweeping signature to digital payment orders without bothering to read a single attached invoice. She trusted her husband implicitly. Yes, but more importantly, she was entirely addicted to the intoxicating rush of being the undisputed queen of the philanthropic gala circuit. As long as she had a fresh, custom designer gown for every single photo opportunity, she willfully ignored the blazing financial fires burning right behind her. My mother's involvement was far more deliberate and infinitely more selfish. Evelyn held the prestigious, seemingly ceremonial title of honorary treasurer for the board of directors. I found a highly classified, secondary ledger buried deep in Bryce's administrative files. Evelyn had systematically utilized the charity's operational expense accounts as her own limitless personal credit line. She had repeatedly approved questionable reimbursement requests to quietly pay off her exorbitant country club membership arrears. I stared in absolute disgust at routing numbers that perfectly matched the billing departments of her exclusive cosmetic dermatology clinics and the aggressively high balances on her premium travel credit cards. She was literally using money meant for homeless families to maintain her heavily manicured, high society facade. And then there was my father. Martin Walker had always prided himself on his strict, uncompromising business ethics. He was the man who had mercilessly lectured me just days ago about the importance of building a tangible legacy. But the digital archives exposed him as the ultimate enabler. Martin did not directly siphon cash into his own pockets like Evelyn, but his specific crime was the absolute glue holding the entire illusion together. I found dozens of corporate board meeting minutes, meticulously typed and officially filed. Martin had personally signed every single one of them, validating massive strategic shifts and structural loans. But the embedded metadata on the digital files revealed the undeniable truth. Those meetings had never actually taken place. Martin had routinely logged into the system to backdate his signatures, creating a pristine, entirely fictitious paper trail of corporate governance to legitimize decisions that Bryce had made entirely alone in the dark. They were not innocent victims of a charismatic con artist. They were highly active, deeply willing participants in a sprawling criminal syndicate. On the 30th of December, just 24 hours before the grand event, Callum cracked the final, heavily guarded folder in Bryce's personal directory. It was labeled simply with the date of the gala. Inside was the meticulously detailed run-of-show script for the New Year's Eve celebration, along with a finalized legal contract. We sat in silence, reading the specific stage directions Bryce had written for himself. The plan for the stroke of midnight was not just a simple champagne toast. It was an elaborate, highly public ambush designed specifically to eliminate his final obstacle. Immediately following the countdown, while the wealthy crowd was heavily intoxicated and emotionally primed by a tear-jerking video montage of impoverished neighborhoods, Bryce planned to dramatically announce the formation of a groundbreaking community land alliance. The script explicitly noted that he would then invite me, his dedicated sister-in-law, and the supposed moral compass of the organization, up to the main stage. Under the blinding glare of the media cameras and the immense, crushing peer pressure of 100 elite donors, he was going to present me with the finalized deed transfer for the brownstone. He intended to force me to sign away my grandmother's legacy live on stage, leaving me absolutely no physical or social avenue for retreat without looking like a monster who hated poor families. He is going to lock you in a room with 100 witnesses and put a pen in your hand, Callum noted, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He closed the laptop screen with a soft click. We have more than enough evidence right now to contact the federal authorities. We can have the Bureau raid his offices before the caterers even begin setting up the tables tomorrow morning. I looked away from the dark screen and stared out the window at the quiet, snow-covered street below my historic home. Stopping the gala early would certainly prevent the immediate theft of my property. Bryce would be arrested quietly, perhaps making a tiny blurb on the third page of the local financial newspaper. Evelyn and Martin would undoubtedly hire an army of aggressive defense attorneys. Claiming they were tragically deceived by a rogue son-in-law, they would spin the narrative, retain their precious social standing, and likely avoid prison time by playing the victims. That was not acceptable. A quiet, administrative takedown was entirely too merciful for what they had attempted to do to me. No, I said, turning back to face my husband, feeling a cold. Absolute certainty settled deep into my bones. If we shut it down in the dark, they will find a way to crawl out of the wreckage and maintain their perfect little illusion. Sometimes, the absolute only way to permanently destroy a theatrical production is to let the actors step onto the stage, turn on all the brightest spotlights, and let the entire audience watch the set collapse on top of them. Callum smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that perfectly matched my own. Instead of calling the police to stop the party, we spent the entire final day coordinating a highly classified, devastating counterstrike. I reached out directly to my most trusted contacts at the Metropolitan Civic Integrity Bureau, laying out the exact parameters of the wire fraud. Callum leveraged his massive international weight to quietly contact the legitimate attorneys representing the actual court-appointed receiver for Ashbourne House, along with the heavily armed asset protection unit of the property's true guarantor. We did not cancel the gala. We actively guaranteed it would be the most heavily attended, unforgettable event in the entire history of the city. We built an invisible, inescapable steel cage right around the grand ballroom, and tomorrow night, my family was going to happily lock themselves inside it. The grand foyer of Ashbourne House was illuminated like a feverish winter dream. As I stepped out of my hired car on the freezing evening of the 31st of December, the historic stone facade was completely washed in blinding, theatrical spotlights. Bryce had spared absolutely no expense of his stolen capital to create a flawless illusion of extreme wealth and monumental success. Valets in crisp white coats scrambled over the icy cobblestones, rushing to park a never-ending stream of imported luxury vehicles. Inside, the massive vaulted ceilings echoed with the sharp, melodic notes of a live string quartet playing near the sweeping marble staircase. Towering floral arrangements of rare white orchids and winter lilies choked the air with a cloying, suffocating sweetness. Every corner of the main ballroom was meticulously designed for maximum visual impact. Flashbulbs popped relentlessly as local media outlets and hired event photographers snapped pictures of the city's elite standing in front of massive, gold-leafed donor boards. I arrived entirely alone, exactly as I had promised my mother. While the rest of the female guests were heavily draped in sequined ball gowns and ostentatious diamond necklaces, I wore a severely minimalist, floor-length black silk sheath dress. It was a garment completely devoid of embellishment, designed to be practically invisible in a room full of peacocks. As I surrendered my heavy wool coat to the coat check attendant, I noticed the sideways, slightly dismissive glances from a few wealthy patrons. They looked at me and clearly saw a reluctant, unimportant guest, a mandatory familial obligation awkwardly lingering on the fringes of the celebration. They had absolutely no idea I was the one who was about to completely dismantle the entire building. Before I could even reach the main champagne bar, a sudden flash of blinding silver sequins intercepted me. Tessa glided smoothly across the freshly polished terrazzo floor, holding a crystal flute and beaming brightly for a nearby cameraman. "Juliana!" Tessa sang out, her voice pitching perfectly to ensure everyone within a 10-foot radius heard her. She linked her arm aggressively through mine, pulling me tightly into a small circle of extremely wealthy tech executives and legacy heiresses. Her smile was incredibly radiant, perfectly calibrated for a luxury lifestyle magazine cover. But the words she spoke next were sharpened like surgical steel. "Everyone, I absolutely must introduce you to my older sister," Tessa announced, her tone dripping with heavily manufactured affection. "This is Juliana. She is our intensely aloof, incredibly serious compliance auditor. She spends her entire life buried under boring paperwork. But she finally decided to show up tonight to learn what a life actually worth living looks like." The small crowd chuckled politely, offering me condescending, sympathetic smiles. I did not pull my arm away. I simply looked at the circle of wealthy strangers, offering a brief, completely flat nod. "It is certainly a highly educational evening," I replied evenly, my voice quiet but carrying perfectly over the string quartet. Tessa's bright smile tightened just a fraction of an inch, annoyed that I had not flushed with embarrassment or attempted to defend my career, before she could launch another veiled insult. A loud wave of applause rolled through the center of the room. Bryce Klein was holding court. He was standing near the massive, dormant stone fireplace, dressed in a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that probably cost more than a standard mortgage payment. He was currently leading a large pack of major institutional donors on a highly curated tour of the main floor. It required pure, unadulterated vision. Bryce boasted loudly, his hands gesturing grandly toward the towering ceiling. "When I first acquired this historic property, everyone said it was entirely too far gone. But with immense passion, relentless dedication, and the absolute best high-level municipal connections in the entire state, we breathed life back into these walls. We are standing inside the future of charitable community housing." The investors murmured in absolute awe, nodding their heads in deep respect. I quietly detached myself from Tessa's group and trailed slowly behind Bryce's tour, letting my trained, forensic gaze sweep over the grand architecture. To the untrained eye of a wealthy philanthropist, the room looked spectacular. To a senior compliance investigator, it looked like a hastily assembled movie set actively teetering on the edge of total structural collapse. The physical anomalies were glaringly obvious if you knew exactly where to look. As I passed a cluster of heavy velvet armchairs near the eastern wall, I clearly saw the bright yellow barcode tags of a weekly corporate furniture rental agency still heavily stapled underneath the silk cushions. They did not own the antique furniture. They were renting it by the hour. I walked past the grand hallway leading to the western wing and noticed heavy, industrial steel padlocks securing the heavy fire doors. The two secondary corridors were completely sealed shut because the building entirely lacked the mandatory safety sprinkler systems required to pass a basic municipal code inspection. When we passed the ornate brass elevator banks, I glanced at the interior wall of the open car. The legally required, state-certified metal plaque displaying the maximum weight load and the official inspector's signature was completely missing. The entire grand gala was literally being held together by temporary rentals, locked doors, and brazen legal violations. Bryce finally paused his grand speech near the center of the room to allow the waiters to distribute fresh glasses of vintage champagne. The investors were completely captivated, practically reaching for their checkbooks. I stepped forward, smoothly inserting myself directly into his line of sight. It is an incredibly impressive aesthetic achievement. Bryce, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sudden lull in the conversation. The architectural restoration is quite striking, but I am curious about the structural financial mechanisms securing the property. Bryce's head snapped toward me. His manufactured smile remained plastered on his face, but his eyes instantly hardened into dark, anxious stones. Of course, Juliana, Bryce replied smoothly, playing the gracious host for the surrounding billionaires. What exactly would you like to know? I tilted my head slightly, my tone conversational, polite, and entirely lethal. As a matter of routine transparency, where exactly is the primary escrow fund currently domiciled? Furthermore, under what specific legal capacity was the operational right of use granted for this specific event? And, just for clarity, on what exact date was the final, unconditional certificate of occupancy formally signed by the city planner? The questions sounded like standard, boring bureaucratic inquiries to the untrained ears of the party guests. But to Bryce, they were the equivalent of a live hand grenade rolling directly to his feet. Every single term I used was a direct, targeted strike against his massive, hidden fraud. He had no escrow fund because he was stealing the money. He had no legal capacity because he was illegally squatting in a foreclosed property. He had no certificate of occupancy because the building was a massive fire hazard. Bryce swallowed hard. The thick tendon in his neck jumped visibly against his stiff white collar. Those are highly technical administrative details. Juliana. Bryce deflected smoothly, projecting a confident, dismissive chuckle for the audience. We have an entire floor of highly paid corporate attorneys who handle the boring paperwork. Tonight is strictly about celebrating the grand vision. He lied flawlessly to the crowd, but I was standing close enough to see the terrifying truth. The tiny muscles at the very corner of his left eye were twitching uncontrollably. A thin, cold layer of sweat was beginning to form right along his hairline. He was a man suddenly realizing he had wandered far out of his depth and was currently drowning in hostile waters, desperate to regain control of the narrative and neutralize the threat I posed. Bryce suddenly raised his champagne glass high into the air, signaling the room for attention. In fact, speaking of compliance and absolute transparency, Bryce announced loudly, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers, I have a very special preliminary announcement. At exactly midnight tonight, my brilliant sister-in-law, Juliana Walker, will officially join our executive advisory board. She will serve as the undisputed compliance conscience of the Second Harbor Renewal Fund, guaranteeing our investors the highest possible ethical standards. He looked directly at me, a silent, desperate threat burning in his eyes. He was publicly locking me into his sinking ship, daring me to cause a scene in front of the most powerful people in the city. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or object. I simply looked at him, surrounded by his rented furniture and his stolen glory, and I offered him a very slow, genuine smile. It was not a warm smile. It was the cold, terrifying smile of an executioner verifying the sharpness of the blade. The expression was so entirely devoid of joy, so deeply unsettling, that the older, seasoned hedge fund manager standing directly next to me actually took a subconscious step backward. A sudden, inexplicable chill seemed to rapidly drop the temperature in the immediate vicinity. Bryce's triumphant announcement hung heavily in the air, but the wealthy predators in the room suddenly stopped looking at him, their sharp instincts suddenly warning them that the real danger in the room was the quiet woman in the black dress who was no longer playing the victim. It was exactly 11:45 in the evening. The grand ballroom was completely consumed by the chaotic, swirling energy of the impending countdown. Waiters were frantically weaving through the dense crowd of billionaires, carrying massive silver trays loaded with freshly poured champagne. The string quartet had been abruptly replaced by a highly energetic, 12-piece jazz band that sent heavy, rhythmic vibrations right through the soles of my shoes. The noise was entirely deafening, the air practically boiling with expensive perfume and collective anticipation. Right as I turned away from the grand fireplace, a heavy hand clamped down violently onto my bare shoulder. I did not flinch. I slowly turned my head to see Bryce standing dangerously close. The charming, camera-ready veneer he had maintained for the last 3 hours had completely evaporated. His handsome face was tightly drawn, his jaw locked in a rigid line of pure, unadulterated desperation. "We need to have a private conversation," Bryce ordered, his voice dropping into a harsh, grating whisper that barely cut through the loud brass instruments playing behind us. Right now, he did not wait for my consent. His grip tightened painfully on my arm, and he forcefully steered me away from the bright center of the room, pushing me aggressively through a set of heavy, velvet-draped double doors hidden completely in the western shadow of the grand hall. The heavy doors slammed shut behind us, instantly silencing the roaring jazz band to a dull, distant thud. We were standing in an old, unrenovated library space. The air in the room was entirely stagnant, smelling sharply of ancient dust, rotting wood, and the bitter tang of Bryce's nervous sweat. The only light source was a single, harsh brass desk lamp resting on a scarred mahogany table in the center of the dark room. Resting directly under the stark white beam of the lamp was a fresh, pristine stack of legal documents. Bryce released my arm, walked rapidly around the table, and slammed his flat palm down onto the thick paper. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a manic, cornered intensity. "The games are officially over, Juliana," Bryce spat out, completely abandoning the polished vocabulary of a philanthropic visionary. "You are going to take the pen sitting right there, and you are going to sign every single page of this dossier before the clock strikes midnight." I stepped calmly up to the edge of the mahogany table, keeping my breathing perfectly even. I looked down at the documents. It was not just the honorary board membership agreement he had tried to force on me at Christmas. Attached directly behind the primary signature page was a highly complex, heavily expedited property transfer appendix. It was a legal maneuver designed to completely sever my ownership of the brownstone. The document officially surrendered the exclusive use rights and the critical rear alleyway access of my grandmother's property over to a newly incorporated entity called the Community Heritage Development Trust. I did not need Callum's team of forensic accountants to analyze the structure. I could read the aggressive, predatory legal language perfectly on my own. The trust was practically a ghost. It was strategically buried beneath 3 distinct layers of corporate shielding, all ultimately leading straight back to Bryce's absolute, unilateral control. "This is incredibly sloppy work, Bryce," I noted quietly, my voice echoing slightly in the empty, dusty library. "You are trying to steal my family home through a hollow shell company while standing inside a building you do not even legally own. I am securing the necessary assets to keep this entire operation afloat." Bryce fired back, his voice rising in volume, fueled by pure adrenaline and blind panic. "If you sign that paper right now, I will personally guarantee that your name is entirely scrubbed from the digital archives. All the forged board resolutions, all the backdated compliance approvals I planted on the servers, they all vanish completely into thin air. You walk away completely clean." He leaned in closer, baring his teeth in a savage, ugly grimace. "But if you refuse," Bryce threatened, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face, "if you try to walk out of this room without signing, I promise you, I will press send on my laptop by 8 o'clock on Monday morning. Every single regulatory agency and major newspaper in this city will receive a massive data dump proving that you were the absolute mastermind behind the Second Harbor renewal fraud. You will lose your career, your freedom, and that pathetic little bookstore in one single strike." Before I could even formulate a response to his clumsy extortion, the heavy velvet doors behind me opened with a soft, ominous click. Tessa stepped into the dim light of the library. She had abandoned her champagne flute. Her face was completely stripped of its usual, breathy innocence, for the very first time in my entire life. I looked at my younger sister and saw the cold, hard, calculating machinery operating beneath her flawless exterior. "Just sign the damn papers, Juliana," Tessa demanded, her voice flat and completely devoid of any familial warmth. Do not pretend you do not understand how the real world operates. It is just a tiny strip of dirt and an old brick wall. It is an incredibly small, insignificant sacrifice for the greater good of this family. I stared at her, genuinely taken aback by the sheer depth of her complicity. You know exactly what he is doing. Do you not? You know he is completely faking the charity. You know this is a massive financial crime, and you are actively helping him steal my house to cover his tracks. I know that my husband is building an empire, Tessa retorted fiercely, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with Bryce. I know that to achieve massive success, you sometimes have to completely bypass the boring, restrictive rules that people like you worship. We are creating a legacy. You are just being a stubborn, selfish obstacle. The door opened a second time. Evelyn glided into the room, her posture as rigid as a steel rod, her eyes glittering with absolute, unforgiving judgment. She looked at the unsigned documents on the table, then turned her cold, piercing gaze directly onto me. This entire dramatic display is completely unnecessary, my mother stated, her tone dripping with absolute contempt. That brownstone should have been given to Tessa from the very beginning. Your grandmother was completely out of her mind to leave such a valuable asset to someone who refuses to contribute anything to our social standing. If you possess even a single ounce of loyalty or basic human decency, you will sign that transfer right now. You owe this family, Juliana. It is time you finally gave us what we rightfully deserve. I was completely surrounded. My mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law had formed a tight, suffocating triangle of hostility in the dark room. They were absolutely convinced that their combined psychological pressure would finally break me, just as it always had when I was a helpless child. But I was no longer a child, and they had severely miscalculated the situation. Bryce, deeply intoxicated by the presence of his loyal enablers and fully believing he had successfully cornered me, lost the last shred of his tactical discipline. His ego, massively inflated by the grand gala happening just outside the door, finally demanded to take a victory lap. You really think you are so incredibly smart? Bryce gloated, pacing back and forth behind the desk, completely unable to contain his arrogant triumph. You think you can just look down on me because you have a fancy title at a forensic firm, but I am the one playing the game at the highest possible level. I need your pathetic piece of land to pass the municipal fire code. The absolute second you sign that paper, I can officially submit the finalized architectural plans. That single signature unlocks a historic, government-backed credit line worth tens of millions of dollars. This entire party tonight is nothing but a glittering, expensive smokescreen to keep the wealthy donors completely distracted while I secure the real money to bypass the federal audit next week. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that bounced off the dusty bookshelves. He was practically vibrating with the thrill of his own perceived brilliance. And once that massive loan is fully disbursed, Bryce continued, speaking rapidly, his eyes entirely detached from the reality of the room, completely lost in his own delusions of grandeur. Everything completely changes. The entire brand evolves. He stopped pacing and looked up, staring right past me. He did not look at Evelyn. He did not look at his wife. The market does not actually want a glamorous, society-obsessed golden couple, Bryce stated, his voice suddenly dropping into a cold, highly analytical register that completely shattered the triumphant atmosphere. Institutional investors want a serious, solitary visionary. Once the capital is secured, the entire narrative of the beautiful husband and wife charity team will be systematically retired. It is entirely too messy, too distracting. I will need a completely different, much more professional image to take this company national. The library plunged into an absolute, terrifying silence. Evelyn physically recoiled, her eyes widening in sudden, sharp shock. But it was Tessa who completely shattered. My sister stood frozen in the dim light, her breath catching audibly in her throat. The color drained out of her face so rapidly, she looked like a polished marble statue. Bryce had just casually, brutally admitted that the moment he legally secured his stolen millions, he was going to completely discard her. She was not his partner in the grand empire. She was merely a highly photogenic, temporary prop, a useful tool that was about to be officially decommissioned. Bryce finally registered the crushing silence in the room. He blinked, looking at Tessa's horrified, devastated expression, instantly realizing the massive, fatal error he had just committed in his arrogant monologue. "Tessa," Bryce stammered, his confident posture collapsing instantly. "That is not what I meant. It is just a long-term public relations strategy." I did not speak. I did not need to offer a single word of argument, defense, or condemnation. I simply stood in the center of the dark room and looked at the man who had just completely destroyed his own marriage and confessed to a massive federal conspiracy in the span of 2 minutes. Slowly, without ever breaking eye contact with Bryce, I slipped my right hand deep into the pocket of my black silk dress. My fingers found the cold, smooth metal edge of my heavily encrypted mobile phone. I located the small tactile switch on the side of the device. With a single, silent push of my thumb, I ended the secure recording and saved the audio file. Every single threat, every single arrogant confession about the tens of millions of dollars, the shell companies, the smokescreen gala, and the brutal betrayal of his own wife had been captured in flawless, high-definition digital audio. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had completely crushed them, and the clock was only 5 minutes away from midnight. I walked out of the suffocating, dark library and stepped right back into the overwhelming sensory assault of the grand ballroom. Bryce burst through the heavy velvet doors a split second later, practically shoving his way past me. His face was a mask of sheer panic, completely stripped of its previous arrogant triumph. He needed the countdown to happen immediately. He needed the loud music, the blinding flashes of the cameras, and the flowing alcohol to somehow cover the massive, undeniable cracks rapidly forming in the foundation of his fake empire. But the collapse had already begun on the outer edges of the room. As Bryce sprinted toward the main stage, a frantic man, wearing the crisp black suit of the elite catering company, intercepted him right near the champagne tower. The manager was pale and sweating, holding a glowing digital tablet like a shield. I lingered just a few feet away, perfectly positioned to hear the entire desperate exchange. "Mr. Klein," the catering manager urged, his voice tight with rising panic, "I am incredibly sorry to interrupt, but we have a catastrophic administrative issue. Our accounting department just flagged your final wire transfer for the evening. The payment for the alcohol, the staff, and the caviar service was just abruptly suspended by your bank. The system is showing a hard freeze on all outbound capital from the Second Harbor accounts." Bryce swallowed audibly, his eyes darting wildly around the room to ensure none of the billionaire donors had overheard. "It is just a temporary routing error," Bryce hissed, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. "A simple weekend glitch with the international servers. Serve the vintage bottles immediately. I will personally clear the hold on Monday morning." Before the catering manager could protest the obvious lie, a young woman wearing a technical headset sprinted over from the eastern corridor. She grabbed Bryce by the sleeve of his expensive tuxedo, her eyes wide with absolute terror. "Bryce!" she whispered frantically, her voice trembling. "The front door security team just radioed the control booth. There are 3 unmarked vehicles pulling up to the main gate. The guards said they are highly aggressive municipal inspectors from the Building Safety Division, and they are demanding immediate entry to check the fire suppression valves. If they walk into this ballroom and see the sealed emergency exits, they will instantly pull the power grid and order a total police evacuation." Bryce looked like a man who had just been violently struck by a speeding train. His lungs heaved as he desperately tried to draw oxygen into his paralyzed chest. He violently shook off the technical manager, completely ignoring the catastrophic warnings. He bounded up the short staircase to the main stage, grabbing the heavy silver microphone from its stand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bryce announced, his voice echoing with a frantic, forced cheerfulness that sounded entirely unhinged, "please gather around the main stage. We are just minutes away from the stroke of midnight. Let us bring everyone together to celebrate the absolute greatest achievement in the history of this city." He was desperately hoping that the sheer momentum of a New Year's Eve countdown would somehow repel the authorities and mask his frozen bank accounts. Right at that exact second, the massive, towering oak doors at the main entrance of Ashbourne House swung open with a resounding, heavy thud that completely overpowered the jazz band. The freezing winter wind rushed into the overheated ballroom, carrying with it a sudden, terrifying silence that rapidly spread from the doorway inward. The wealthy guests nearest the entrance stopped talking, naturally stepping aside to create a wide, clear path. Callum Price walked into the grand hall. He did not make a flashy, arrogant entrance. There was no entourage, no brightly colored velvet jacket, and absolutely no performative smile. He wore a flawlessly tailored, charcoal gray suit that spoke of quiet, generational wealth. He moved with the terrifying, absolute stillness of a predator stepping onto his own undisputed territory. He did not look like a guest arriving late to a charity gala. He looked like the true master of the house arriving to evict a very unruly, very foolish tenant. I stepped smoothly through the parting crowd, leaving Tessa and my parents completely frozen near the edge of the stage, and walked directly to the center of the room to meet him. Callum stopped walking, his dark, calculating eyes briefly scanning the rented chandeliers and the panicked face of Bryce Klein on the stage, before his gaze finally settled on me. Evelyn, Martin, and Tessa had hurried forward, desperate to maintain the illusion of control in front of the elite donors who were now watching this strange interaction with intense curiosity. I turned slightly to face my family, my voice calm, clear, and perfectly projected for the surrounding audience of major investors to hear. "Mother, father, Tessa," I said, offering an introduction completely devoid of warmth. "Allow me to introduce Callum Price. He is my husband." The collective shock that slammed into my family was a physical, almost violent force. Martin's jaw literally dropped open, his glass of expensive scotch tilting dangerously in his hand. Evelyn gasped sharply, her manicured hand flying up to cover her mouth in absolute unadulterated horror. Just days ago, they had aggressively mocked me, completely convinced I had purchased a fake platinum ring to hide my pathetic loneliness. Now, they were staring directly at a man who exuded more raw, terrifying power in a single glance than their entire fabricated social circle combined. Bryce desperately tried to seize the narrative. He forced a sickeningly bright smile onto his sweating face, practically jumping off the stage to approach Callum. He extended his hand in a classic, aggressive corporate greeting, attempting to establish false dominance. "Callum," Bryce boomed, his voice dripping with fake, masculine camaraderie. "What an absolute surprise. Welcome to Ashbourne House. I am Bryce Klein. It is incredible to finally meet the man who managed to lock down our stubborn Juliana." Callum did not raise his hand. He did not smile. He simply looked down at Bryce's outstretched hand as if it were a diseased piece of rotting meat. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds before Callum finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but the deep, resonant baritone carried an unmistakable, lethal authority that made the nearby hedge fund managers instinctively hold their breath. "I do not engage in pleasantries with trespassers," Callum stated coldly. Bryce's fake smile shattered completely. He awkwardly pulled his hand back, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "I beg your pardon." Callum stepped 1 inch closer, completely invading Bryce's personal space. He did not raise his voice, but his words hit like precision sniper fire. "I have exactly 3 questions for you." "Mr. Klein," Callum demanded, his tone perfectly even and absolutely terrifying. "First, under whose specific, documented legal authority did you override the municipal foreclosure locks on a property that is currently supervised by a federal receiver? Second, can you explain to this room of generous investors why the primary escrow accounts for the Second Harbor Fund were permanently frozen by the Financial Crimes Division precisely 40 minutes ago? And third, are you fully aware that hosting a heavily ticketed, enclosed event inside a commercial structure completely lacking a certified fire suppression system constitutes a felony endangerment charge. The grand ballroom went so incredibly quiet, you could hear the ice melting in the crystal cocktail glasses. Bryce opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. He stammered, his eyes darting frantically back and forth, completely unable to formulate a single coherent lie under the crushing weight of Callum's perfectly accurate accusations. The wealthy donors surrounding us instantly recognized the unmistakable scent of a massive, catastrophic financial collapse. Two highly prominent venture capitalists immediately pulled their mobile phones from their tuxedo pockets, furiously typing messages to their legal teams. A veteran investor couple, people who had survived 3 different market crashes, exchanged a single, grim look and quietly began walking backward toward the coat check, perfectly understanding that this glamorous party was rapidly transforming into an active federal crime scene. Tessa, completely blinded by her desperate need to save her social standing, rushed forward and grabbed Bryce's arm. Her voice was shrill and completely hysterical. "Do not listen to a single word he says," Tessa shouted to the retreating donors, her flawless makeup beginning to crack under the strain. Bryce is fully backed by the absolute highest tier of political power in this state. Juliana is just insanely jealous of our success. She deliberately brought this man here to ruin our family because she is bitter and vindictive. Callum did not even bother to look at Tessa. He casually raised his left arm, pulling back the cuff of his suit to glance at his elegant, understated silver watch. "It is currently 3 minutes to midnight," Callum announced, his voice slicing cleanly through Tessa's frantic screaming. He raised his eyes and locked them directly onto Bryce's terrified, sweating face. "If you enjoy putting on a massive theatrical performance for a crowd, Bryce, we do not need to whisper. We can simply wait for the clock to strike 12, and we can make the final. Devastating disclosures completely public." The clock was exactly 1 minute away from midnight. Bryce Klein, completely out of options and drowning in his own manufactured panic, decided to double down on his delusions. He sprinted back up the short stairs to the main stage, violently gripping the heavy silver microphone. The 12-piece jazz band abruptly stopped playing, leaving the grand ballroom in a tense, expectant silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bryce projected, his voice cracking slightly but still loud enough to command the massive room. "Before we count down to the new year, it is my absolute honor to introduce the true moral compass of the Second Harbor Renewal Fund. Please welcome my sister-in-law, Juliana Walker, to the stage to officially accept her position on our executive advisory board." He was desperately trying to use me as a human shield. I smoothly ascended the carpeted stairs. I did not wear a forced smile. I stepped directly up to the main podium, gently but firmly taking the microphone right out of Bryce's sweating hand. "Thank you for the introduction, Bryce," I said smoothly, my voice echoing clearly off the vaulted ceiling. "However, I am absolutely not here tonight to endorse this organization. I am here to present the finalized financial audit." I gave a subtle nod toward the back of the room. Callum had already positioned his private security technicians inside the main audiovisual control booth. Instantly, the massive, high-definition projection screens flanking the stage flickered. The glowing gold logo of the charity vanished entirely. In its place, glaringly bright and impossible to ignore, was a massive image of the forged board resolution containing my heavily pixelated, copied signature. A collective gasp rippled through the sea of wealthy donors. "What you are looking at is a legally binding document forged entirely by Bryce Klein," I announced to the silent room, "and it is only the beginning." The screen flashed again. This time, it displayed the highly classified property transfer deed for my grandmother's brownstone, followed immediately by a sprawling, undeniable spreadsheet of the charity's primary bank ledgers. "Every single dollar you generously donated to build subsidized community housing was immediately funneled into 3 anonymous corporate shell companies," I explained, gesturing toward the highlighted offshore routing numbers. "Those companies are controlled exclusively by the man standing right next to me. He used your philanthropic goodwill to pay for luxury vehicles, fake consulting fees, and his own personal debts. Bryce lunged forward, desperately, trying to snatch the microphone back. "Turn the screens off right now. She is lying. She is a bitter, jealous woman trying to destroy her own family." Before Bryce could even touch me, Callum stepped directly up to the edge of the stage. He held up a thick, legally stamped manila folder. "I hold in my hand an emergency injunction from the Federal Receivership Court," Callum declared, his powerful voice requiring no microphone to command absolute authority. "Bryce Klein does not own Ashbourne House. He illegally broke into a foreclosed property to host this fraudulent gala. As the newly appointed legal custodian of this asset, I am officially declaring this building a frozen crime scene." The wealthy investors erupted into chaotic shouts. The illusion was completely shattered, but I needed to ensure my family could never, ever spin the narrative to paint themselves as innocent victims. I pulled my encrypted mobile phone from my pocket and connected it directly to the podium's auxiliary input. I pressed play on the audio file I had recorded in the dusty library just 15 minutes earlier. The crystal-clear audio blasted through the massive concert speakers. Bryce's own arrogant, panicked voice filled the grand ballroom. The entire crowd heard him explicitly detail his desperate need to steal my land to secure a loan worth tens of millions of dollars. They heard him confess that this entire lavish New Year's Eve party was nothing but an expensive smokescreen to distract from his imminent federal audit. Worse, they heard him brutally state that he planned to completely discard his own wife the absolute second the loan was fully disbursed. Tessa let out a sharp, agonizing wail from the front row. The reality finally hit her with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. She was not the beloved queen of a philanthropic empire. She was nothing but a convenient, highly photogenic pawn in a massive criminal conspiracy. And her own husband had always planned to throw her away. The audio continued playing, broadcasting Evelyn's cold, cruel voice aggressively demanding that I surrender my inheritance to feed the family's insatiable hunger for social status. I looked down at my parents. Evelyn and Martin were standing frozen in the front row, completely surrounded by furious billionaires and powerful legacy families. They could not play the victims. The entire city now knew they were active, greedy accomplices who had willingly tried to destroy their own daughter just to secure a few more invitations to elite country clubs. They had suffered the ultimate, fatal social death. Right as the audio recording finished playing, the heavy double doors at the main entrance burst open for the final time. A dozen agents from the Metropolitan Civic Integrity Bureau, accompanied by heavily armed asset protection officers representing the true property owners, swarmed into the grand ballroom. They immediately began securing the exits, confiscating the digital donation kiosks, and ordering the catering staff to step away from their stations. Bryce fell to his knees on the carpeted stage, his face buried in his hands, completely broken by the cold, undeniable precision of the facts. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity. "Just for the record," I said quietly, leaning directly into the microphone for one final, lethal statement. "The title to the brownstone was officially transferred into a blind trust yesterday morning. It is completely locked away. None of you will ever be able to touch it. Furthermore, from this moment forward, I have no family. Any future communication regarding this matter will go exclusively through my retained legal counsel." I did not stay to watch them place the cold steel handcuffs on Bryce. I did not stay to watch the furious donors scream at my completely disgraced parents. I simply turned my back on the stage, walked down the stairs, and took Callum's offered hand. We walked through the collapsing remains of their fake empire and stepped out into the crisp winter night. In the months that followed the catastrophic collapse of Ashbourne House, the consequences were absolute. Tessa lost every single ounce of her precious social standing, eventually filing for a highly publicized, messy divorce while actively dodging federal subpoenas. Bryce faced a massive, multi-tiered federal indictment for wire fraud, bank fraud, and grand larceny. Evelyn and Martin became the ultimate pariahs of their wealthy suburban enclave. Entirely blacklisted from every country club and charity board they had once desperately worshipped, they had nothing left but their empty, echoing estate and their profound shame. But Callum and I did not waste our time looking backward. We focused entirely on the future. We transformed my grandmother's historic brownstone into something genuinely powerful and deeply necessary. We kept the charming little bookstore operating on the ground floor, but we completely renovated the back rooms into a free, highly secure housing and financial consulting clinic. We provided expert legal guidance and safe harbor for women who were actively facing financial manipulation and domestic asset abuse. The top 2 floors became our private sanctuary, an incredibly quiet, peaceful home filled with warm light, aging paper, and absolute safety. I had achieved the ultimate, perfect revenge. I did not just expose their toxic greed. I took the exact piece of property they had so viciously tried to steal and used it to build a beautiful, meaningful life that they would never, ever be allowed to enter. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your location in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. And if you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.